Filler can be an irritating or maybe even scary word when it comes to anime. The dreaded episodes or even arcs that were created solely to pad the series out or buy time so the manga it's adapting can get farther ahead. Filler's whole purpose is to stall with anime original content in hopes that you'll keep watching even when they don't have more actual canon material to adapt yet. With the way that a lot of anime were released weekly, many adapting manga that were still ongoing, it was kind of a necessary evil in some respects, but every anime fan has their own personal history with filler. Less so if you're getting into it now, I guess, since many shows are now taking a seasonal approach, like even One Piece is. This makes filler episodes less necessary since you don't need to stall for time anymore. You're gonna have time anyway. And because these stories were used to buy time, they often were designed with that in mind, sometimes even with entire arcs of episodes. I vividly remember the first time I discovered what filler was. I grew up watching Dragon Ball Z like a lot of people did. I don't think I even fully understood that it was an adaptation, or even what manga was at the time. So there was this one episode that I owned on DVD which took place during the training prep for the Saiyans, where Mr. Popo brings some of our heroes into a pendulum room to train. And I loved it at the time because it's centered on the Z fighters that didn't get as much focus, and I always preferred them over the Saiyans. I still do. A few years later, I find volume 2 and 3 of the manga in a bookstore in Delaware, only to discover so many things I knew were missing, including that pendulum room training. No, that group's training was just like one panel. At the time, I thought, oh, they cut it out of the book, so the book wouldn't be so long. Only to realize that manga came first, and the anime added episodes like that one. And even other parts of the series around that time that I'd seen were anime original creations, like Princess Snake, or Vegeta and Nappa fighting those bug people. It blew my mind when I realized how many things were extended or completely new, especially once I realized that those episodes didn't actually contribute to the plot in any meaningful way, and that the story could be told just as clearly, if not more clearly, without those things being filled in. So that was my first experience understanding what filler in anime was. Besides accidentally watching the Forest of Menno filler episodes, which I talked about at length in that analysis video, my reading and adjacent watching of Bleach has avoided the larger filler arcs of the series. I had been following a list that mostly followed the canon episodes of Bleach, like occasionally you'd get things that had some filler stuff mixed in, or sometimes that stuff would be in the canon things, but yeah, in general I've been avoiding the filler arcs. I'd been told some of them were long or not good, or not even worth the time, but I want to explore all of the things that this series has to offer, including the filler. I know they're most likely not canon or relevant to the main plot, and that they can absolutely be skipped, considering that's what I did, but I still want to see what they do offer for further stories in this world. So I really want to take the plunge, and that's what I'm going to be doing now that I'm, getting towards the end of the canon material. Now I know my experience with these filler arcs might be very different from your own. I'm not watching them where they were originally placed, stuck in a filler story for weeks or months while waiting for the actual story to come back. No, I'm doing this as a fun after the fact thing, so I recognize that it'll be a different perspective. I'm not going to have that pure experience of having these episodes delay what really comes next, but I'm going to do my best to keep that in mind and try to put myself in the shoes of someone that was forced to wait for Kubo's Bleach and had to receive these stories in the meantime. So starting off my Bleach filler analysis, let's talk about the first major filler arc of the series, the Bount arc. Going into this, I was somewhat aware of this arc's infamous reputation from friends and early comments on my channel. I knew it wasn't held in the highest regard, and I knew it was considered by many to be a bit of a slog. Even just me saying I was watching it got a pretty clear reaction from a lot of you. Funny story, about a year ago, when I was getting my friend Andrew into Bleach, I'd forgotten to warn him about filler arcs at all, so he's binging the show and texting me updates, all excited about the hype of the Soul Society arc, and Ichigo's Bankai, and Aizen's betrayal, and then all of a sudden, nothing. I'm not hearing anything about his Bleach journey, so I text him and I'm like, hey, where are you at in the series? And I'm excited to hear his reactions about Grimmjow and Ishin and things like that, completely forgetting that there's a filler between the Soul Society arc and the Arrancar arc. Because I didn't watch it, so I wasn't even thinking about it. And he's like, yeah, I stopped watching Bleach around the time it was doing that stuff about dolls. And I'm like, the stuff about dolls? Initially having no idea what he was talking about, and then I realized he must be in a filler. And when I looked at the episode list I was using for myself, I saw that there were nearly 50 episodes of filler that my friend was trapped in. Almost 50, a void of anime original content that acted as a brick wall for his progress and interest in the series. So of course, I sent him what episode he should actually go watch to pick it back up, and he did, thankfully. But the thought of that huge chunk of episodes being so rough that he nearly quit the show was daunting for me, especially as I was facing it down, about to prepare to take it all on. 45 episodes. That's the length of the Bount arc. 45. That's almost a year's worth of Bleach when released weekly. I can't imagine what that was like for people watching it live, especially when you're wanting to see the story actually continue, and you have to wait a year to get back to Kubo's story? A year on pause. So that's kind of the first real hurdle of this arc, I would say. Its placement within the actual Bleach story. At that point, we had just had the incredible climax of the Soul Society arc with Aizen and setting up the big war between this incredible villain and all of these heroes that we just spent a whole arc establishing, who are now on the same side as Ichigo. The whole series took a huge step in its world building and expanding its scale, and then the anime viewers get this, a filler arc that has absolutely nothing to do with any of that. No Aizen, no Hogyuku, no big war between Soul Society and Wako Mundo, nothing. Again, for me personally, this had zero impact because I didn't watch it until now. No, I got to go straight from the Soul Society to the Arrancar arc, as was intended by the manga, so the hype never hit a roadblock, and I'm so glad I did that, but I can still imagine how much this placement must have taken the wind out of those sails. No matter how good this arc could be on its own, and we'll get to that, it was always going to hinder the actual story in the anime in a massive way with where it was placed and for how long it interrupts the real narrative of Bleach. And I recognize that, even as someone that's watching it after the fact and well aware of that. I'm so sorry for those that didn't know that this was filler, or knew how long it was gonna be, or had to patiently go week to week waiting for Aizen to come back. That had to be brutal. I can't imagine, and I'm honestly, guys, I don't want to rub it in, but I'm so glad I don't have to do that. Putting its unfortunate placement aside, let's get into the story of the Bount arc itself. We have a fairly intriguing setup, honestly, taking place a little after the Soul Society arc. Everyone's back in the world of the living when they're suddenly being forced into these challenges or being sucked into these gateways by this trio of mysterious characters that we eventually find out are mod souls like Kon. Initially, it seems like these mod souls are gonna be primary antagonists, or at least maybe involved with some greater evil. Honestly, the idea of an arc that centers on mod souls really captured my attention at the beginning because that concept is intriguing. The mod souls have mostly gone unexplored outside of Kon's surprisingly tragic backstory, but besides when he was originally introduced, we haven't really dived back into any of that. He's just been a silly side character with a truly horrific backstory that never gets brought up. So initially I thought this will be a chance to get more into that. We know mod souls could have good reason to hate the Soul Society since they were discarded and exterminated. That could make for a really fascinating antagonist and an interesting problem. So is this arc about artificial souls? Nope. I mean, I guess, in a very roundabout technical way, I guess you could say it is, by association, but not the mod souls as we know them. No, despite what the first few episodes had me believe, these are not the villains of this arc. This is not gonna be about mod souls. No, these are just three red herrings that are here to test our heroes and seem villainous at the time. And they're secretly working for Urahara, and it felt very similar to another anime that I love. I need to apologize to the Fullbring arc over the fact that I compared it to the Chapter Black arc from Yu Yu Hakusho in some respects. I still maintain that there are some definite thematic similarities, especially with its vibe and villain, but I still need to ask for Ginjo's forgiveness, because the Bount arc is the one that's actually the Chapter Black arc in a lot more direct ways. Like a lot of ways. Like copy and paste, blatantly almost a knockoff in some respects. It's wild how close this is to the Chapter Black arc in Yu Yu Hakusho. For example, here at the beginning we get a few episodes where these 3 new enemies test out our heroes with challenges seeming to be new enemies, only to turn out to be secretly working for the mysterious mentor character to help prepare everyone for the actual real threat, which is literally exactly what happened at the start of Chapter Black. And this is just the first instance of something very, very similar to it that I'll be mentioning throughout this video. Don't worry, there's gonna be plenty more. These first few episodes were a bit of a bait and switch. As someone interested in mod souls, I was kind of locked in and on board, only to have that pulled away. Although these characters would be sticking around throughout the arc, so let's talk a bit about them. What do I think of the 3 new mod souls? They were alright. Ririne was this brash, bratty kind of character that annoyed me a bit. She could create illusions, which was used a lot when she was an antagonist, but hardly ever when she was on our side. She just wasn't a super likable character though, so I wasn't a big fan of hers, and honestly I'm kinda glad that she didn't end up being an antagonist in the arc. When she wasn't giggling at people, she was just yelling a lot, especially her and Kon had this back and forth, and she was just kind of fulfilling Kon's role on Ichigo's shoulders a lot of the time. I kept waiting for something to endear me to her, but nothing ever did, unfortunately. I also found myself feeling a bit lukewarm about Kuroto. I like his style and his design and his general demeanor, especially when he's teamed up with Orihime, and I really enjoyed his shape-shifting and I wanted it to be utilized more, but I never fully warmed up to him either. As for the last of the 3, Noba is awesome. Easily the best of the 3. He had a cool design, a funny gag with his zipper, and the best powers where he could open portals, and he actually used them quite a bit to help out. He felt the most useful in the times when he did contribute, and he was the most, I'd say the closest thing they have to a badass, even though I don't know if I'd even go that far. I just really liked him. I liked him a lot. And I especially liked when he was in his little plushie form, because good god. Yeah, all 3 of the mod souls are placed inside of plushies like Kon, so we get some occasional cute hijinks, and again, Noba as the turtle with the bow tie might be one of the cutest things I've ever seen, so that was a little fun. But I found myself asking, why? Unlike Kon, these 3 had Gigai that they were already using, so I don't understand why they needed to become stuffed animals to begin with. They had a place to go. Kon had Ichigo's body at first and then, was put inside the plushie, but they had Gigais? I don't understand why that was necessary. Marketing wise, like for the show, sure, makes sense, you could make some cute plushies out of them, but in story, I was a bit perplexed by it because they had to keep running back to their Gigai anyway, and their powers were severely hindered when they were in their plushie forms, and I think their detection abilities worked either way too, so if it was to blend in while they're going about the world of the living, I guess that's an explanation, but instead of roaming the streets as talking plushies, which isn't that normal and would draw attention, possibly, why not just change your clothes? Anyway, while they didn't turn out to be villains, they were still pretty present in the arc as protagonists, even if they weren't as important as I thought they'd be. They were relegated to more cute comic relief mascots, and then walking, talking dragon radars when we needed them to be, since they could detect the new enemies and help our heroes pursue them. It was funny realizing that I already sort of know the 3 of them though, because when I was first watching the Arrancar arc way back, they were around at the beginning in the anime, and I had no idea who they were since I skipped this arc, so I finally got context. But yeah, the anime had them bleed over into the canon, and I kind of hate when shows do that. Let the filler stay with the filler. I always hated how the big moment of entering the Grand Line in Reverse Mountain in the One Piece anime is interrupted by that filler villain from the Dragon arc that was right before it, that filler Dragon arc. So unnecessary. For the people that skip filler, it just leaves us confused. Don't try to make me watch the filler if I don't want to. But yeah, I realized I'd seen them in the arc after this, so I knew those 3 were gonna make it out of this fine, so that was a bit of a spoiler as well. But I didn't really expect them to die, but they could've, but I knew they wouldn't. But yeah, overall, I didn't hate the 3 mod souls, but if they were gonna be so present the whole arc, I wish they were at least given more depth or actual relevance to the plot, or were more helpful more often. I love Noba though, and he can do no wrong. But yes, at the beginning of the arc, we get pulled around for like 3 or 4 episodes by these mod souls that work for Urahara, before he introduces the concept of the actual villains of this story, the eponymous Bounts. Obviously, the Bounts aren't a faction ever brought up in Kubo's story. They were created by the anime studio solely for this anime arc, but serve as our group of enemies that Ichigo will have to thwart, a separate problem from anything going on in the canon. And the way they kind of get around this is obviously this was when Aizen retreated to Hueco Mundo at the end of the Soul Society arc, after he got the Hogaku, and he's busy building up his army of Arancars and waiting for the Hogaku and all that stuff. It can fit in timeline-wise. Like I was saying earlier, the actual placement of a giant filler arc in this section of the story might not be ideal for the viewers, but yeah, it makes sense timeline-wise. Aizen is busy in Hueco Mundo, so we can have another group of villains doing all this. As someone that has watched the Bleach movies already, I know the track record for original villains Kubo didn't create isn't always great. There's a couple that are solid and even pretty good, but most of the film villains were definitely not groundbreaking, but hey, those were movies with limited runtimes, whereas this Bount arc has almost a limitless amount of minutes to give us a great group of villains. So are they effective bad guys? Well, it's complicated, so let's break them down. What's the Bount's deal? Who are they? From what we're originally told, the Bounts seem somewhat similar to Quincy's in some ways, being born with supernatural gifts that they hone, although they differ in a few big ways. Instead of harnessing spiritual energy to fire arrows, they use what are called dolls, which was what my friend meant when he was telling me he was stuck at the arc about dolls, and thankfully it's not as creepy as I expected. Dolls can sometimes terrify me. This wasn't that. Thank the maker. The dolls are kind of like Zanpakuto in that they are manifestations of the power within, but they're a bit more tangible in a way than Zanpakuto spirits usually are, and are kind of a separate entity that the Bount commands, and sometimes the doll doesn't listen to the Bount, or if you're too weak, it won't obey you anymore. They're kind of their own thing, like they were kind of giving like Digimon in some ways, since many of them talk and have their own personalities, but they're usually sealed away in a specific item, which is kind of like Fullbringers, and their own personalized items housing their power as well. It was interesting. There are some parallels between the Bounts and the Fullbringers that I thought was pretty interesting, considering the Fullbringers didn't come till quite a bit later. I'm not sure if that was Kubo trying to do his own spin on it, if that was completely separate, I don't know, but there are some interesting parallels. The concept of the dolls is pretty cool and a unique spin compared to a lot of the other power sets in the series. I enjoyed most of them, especially Dalk. She was great. The biggest thing about Bounts, though, is that they don't just absorb reishi, but also devour souls in order to maintain their immortality. As long as they're eating, they will have eternal life. So I'm sitting there thinking, that sounds a whole lot like vampires. And then 20 seconds later, they literally confirm that the Bounts are sometimes called vampires. Yes, vampires. Ichigo is going up against actual vampires. It's like that one Batman movie when I was a kid where he randomly fought Dracula. That movie was awesome, by the way. It was legitimately really good, like shockingly good. Anyway, I don't think I've really had much of a chance to talk about this, but I'm a big fan of vampires in general and always have been. They are some of the most versatile monsters where they can work in so many different ways throughout so many different genres, so I was honestly really excited to see what Bleach's take on them would be, after I got over my initial shock that Bleach is doing vampires. Like with most vampire lore in different stories, it's a different interpretation. There aren't fangs or sucking blood or wooden stakes or garlic or a lot of the other tropes, but there were still some core aspects that made it clear that yes, this is a version of vampirism. There was the need to feed to keep their immortality, living everlasting lives throughout time and different periods, and even bringing some fun gothic aesthetics and atmosphere into the series. I especially loved their musical theme because it really does fit the moody vampiric vibes that this group gives off. And trust me, the arc doesn't let you forget that the Bounts are immortal vampires burdened by their unchanging existence as they float through the river of time. There's quite a few monologues about it, and they'll find any excuse to talk about it. Like, I'm not even exaggerating, guys. They take a moment to fix a grandfather clock solely so they can then immediately talk about how time keeps turning and they remain the same. And these kinds of monologues happen a lot. Don't get me wrong, one of the most interesting things in vampire stories to me is the immortality and how they relate to time, but they didn't need to be so melodramatic about it at every opportunity. I understand they live forever. I get it. I do wish, though, given how much history they've apparently lived, that we got to see more of their pasts. We really only get to look at like 3 of their lives, and all of those backstories ended up endearing me to those characters way more than the ones we didn't get to learn much about. I'm not saying you need flashbacks. It would have helped maybe to have learned some of their backstories, because their personalities in the present for most of them weren't telling me much. One of my favorite parts of vampire fiction, as someone that also loves history, is seeing them live through different time periods, since there are so many interesting possibilities, but we really didn't get as much of that as I would have liked, and that you easily could have done. And it doesn't help that any sort of vampiric influence kind of gets dropped at the halfway mark of the arc too. Like, they stop talking about needing to feed and devour, and they kind of just don't anymore. The Bount's plan is to eat a lot of living souls instead of the ghosts and spirits that they usually eat, and feeding on the living is usually forbidden, but they're doing this because the residue left behind weakens the barrier between worlds, and they want to open this portal, and they need a Quincy to help them get through and fully break the barrier. So yeah, they're a group of empowered humans that want to open a portal, but also need a special kind of human to fully pry it open. Again, this is just Chapter Black from Yu Yu Hakusho. Straight up, it's wild. Instead of the Sensui 7, we got the Bounts. And instead of Kuwabara, we get Uryu. It's crazy, Urameshi. And Uryu, like Kuwabara, needs to unlock a new way to do this because Kuwabara needed a special spirit sword. You know me. I love me a group of Bleach baddies, but unfortunately, you can tell Kubo wasn't in the kitchen to help cook up these guys, especially compared to the visuals and aesthetics of the other groups from the manga. I don't hate their designs, but I don't think any of them are particularly inspired or memorable either, and character-wise, it's definitely a mixed bag. Let's just go through the list of Bounts. Let's just do it. You had these 2 water boys, who look like Pokemon trainers you'd bump into and have to fight at like the water gym. And they are responsible for maybe my biggest laugh in this entire arc. I'm okay with hydrokinesis and water powers. They can be really cool and threatening sometimes, but the way this was executed here was just really funny. The show did its best to try to make sinks and faucets really scary, and it just didn't work. It all felt so mundane compared to what we've seen our characters go up against already, even at this point after the Soul Society arc. Like, you go from Byakuya and Aizen at the end of that to a leaking drain and living water that's splashing around. The image of the Soul Reapers hacking away at all of that water made me think of that like old story where Caligula sent his armies to fight the ocean. So people were just swinging at the waves. And yes, this water is alive and tried to kill them, sure, but it wasn't hitting the way I think they thought it was. I don't know, it just wasn't great, but man, did I laugh hard when they thought they got away, and then they realized it was raining outside. That was iconic. All of that section just wasn't great, and these 2 weren't intimidating, but at least those couple of episodes were hilarious. And these 2 ended up being a whole lot like Seaman from Chapter Black as well, except lacking the sympathy and the characterization he had that made him, more of a person. And I thought his water manipulation was portrayed much more threateningly than theirs, so there's that too. There's also Udagawa. He is a guy that can turn stuff into snakes. So many snakes. And he's this conniving, deceitful character with ambitions to lead, so is pretty much the Starscream of the Bounts. but not as fun, and not as hilarious, not funny at all really, and not memorable. I honestly completely forgot about him until writing out this script. He really didn't leave a lasting impression. The arc went for another like 35 episodes after he died, and he's just a distant memory by the end. But yeah, he had snakes, and he was a snake, and everything around him was snakes, but outside of that, he was really easy to forget. That's about it. Snakes. Then there was Yoshino, who was a real focal point of the arc for a little while during the first half, because she was the defector, the one that was now going against the group after she'd been loyal for so long. She was soft-spoken and reasonable, so she stood out for that, and she was trying to actually help the heroes a bit and prevent the Bounts from succeeding, and she turned out to be a pretty tragic character, being stuck in this very toxic situation for literally centuries. Her connection with Uryu added an interesting layer as well, and maybe even something a bit romantic, but her story really came to a head with her sacrifice against Karya. Seeing her merge with her doll, who I loved by the way, was an actual hype moment, even if it didn't work out for her in the end. She was fleshed out pretty well, and I enjoyed the role she played overall, so Yoshino, she was one of the good ones. Again, they gave us a backstory, they gave her a bit more of a personality, so yeah, she was one of the better Bounts, I would say. We also have this old man, Sawatari, and I actually really liked his whole vibe. Maybe it's my loyalty to King Baragan, but there's something about an elderly man in a villain group that just feels extra intimidating, especially when he's an old man that's supposedly immortal and doesn't age. He was inherently intriguing, and we learned that he didn't naturally age this much, but instead, Sawatari fed on so many living human souls that it physically aged him from the toll it took on his body, and that's a really scary thought, and that doesn't get explored as much as I wish it did, especially once the other Bounts are like sucking down tons of people. I thought this was going to come back around where they were going to start aging, but nope, not at all. Personality-wise, Sawatari's mostly just a generic bad guy, but he kind of makes up for it with how cool his doll is. Baura is this giant fish thing that looks like it's made of bark, and it can swim through different dimensional planes or trap people inside a void if it devours you. And it was a pretty cool visual when he's like swimming in the dimension beneath you or popping up out of a wall, or, you know, there was a lot of fun little moments they had with Baura that I really liked. And it was fun that half the time he wasn't stored away like the other dolls. A lot of the time, Sawatari was sitting on Baura's back, and it just looks like he's on a chair, because I guess Baura was always sitting mostly in another dimension just beneath view, but popping up just enough to let him sit on it. Loved that. But yes, Sawatari could have been even better if we explored his past more, because you can't tell me something like, this guy ate so many people that he turned into that, and then they gave us like a 2-second glimpse of it. I'm like, what? Why was he doing that? What was going on with him? And then there's Mabushi, and he's one of the more generic looking of the Bounts and could use his cute little flower doll to implant itself into people and take over their minds. Turning allies into enemies is one of those things that seems to happen in fillers when you need to manufacture conflicts between your characters. I don't know if it's, you know, it helps that you don't have to make new villain designs and you can just have the heroes fight the heroes. I don't know. The most interesting thing about Mabushi is that he was the only one of the group that was resistant to the idea of feeding on living souls when the opportunity really presented itself that they could all get this big power up. There was maybe a flicker of morality there, but then it almost seemed like it stemmed solely from him not wanting to end up like Sawatari. So I don't know if it was a real conflict of morality or if it was just him being vain and not wanting to get super old. Whatever the case, once Mabushi was forced to feed, he kind of just completely became a one-note, arrogant villain for the rest of the arc, and we never had that conflict again, and I think that was a missed opportunity. I've talked before about how it feels like every group needs their resident scientist, and the Bounts are no exception. Ugaki is just about as generic of a scientist as you can have. He's just a smart guy with glasses and not a single thing else. Just look at him. That's just the smart guy. Luckily, he has a pretty cool doll, but maybe that's just because I love shadow powers. He was pretty easy to forget, but yeah, they had a smart guy. But Yoshi was the most forgettable, I think. All she really had going on was being really unpleasant. Like, maybe low-key, one of the most cruel characters in Bleach. And then she also had dull weapons that could talk and she could wear like armor. That was kind of it. There wasn't much to her. Not a fan. And there's Koga, who was a shockingly well-developed character and one of the most well-rounded additions to the whole arc. It helped that we got a lot of focus on his past, where despite his big brutish appearance, it turns out he was a gentle giant of a man that just wanted peace and to farm until he was slowly pulled back into Karya's schemes when Karya had a young Bount named Cain stay with him. Cain became something like a son to Koga, but in his attempt to summon a doll, he was killed. And that doll that killed Cain was utterly horrifying, by the way. Utterly horrifying. But yeah, that flashback was actually pretty great and did a lot of legwork and endearing me to Koga a lot. And in the present, he had a good personality. He had a lot of different aspects to him. There was the loyalty to Karya, but he also seemed reserved about other things. I liked him. In general, he was probably the best character of the Bounts. He had one of the more unique designs among them, maybe the best doll, and the most layers as a character, I think. He had a lot more depth than most of them, and I enjoyed his entire character arc all the way through. I knew it was coming. I knew this man was not going to follow Karya the whole time. There was no way. Then we have the leader of the Bounts and our big bad of the arc, Jin Karya, who just reminds me of Pidgey or Pidgeotto, and I can't quite figure out why, if it's the color scheme or the brows or all of it, but every time I saw him, I thought of Pidgey, and that was only solidified once he started using Whirlwind and Gust all over the place with his wind powers. This man was a Pidgey. He also shares part of his name with another wind guy from Yu Yu Hakusho, and while that's not specifically Chapter Black related, still a little suspicious. A little suspicious. The arm wind bands? Suspicious. This studio loved Yu Yu Hakusho. They loved it, and I don't blame them, it's so good. While I didn't think Karya was the greatest villain of all time or anything, Bleach even at this point had set a very high bar for villains with Aizen. Karya had some great moments though, where he really felt like a threat, which was important for an arc like this where a lot of these characters don't sometimes feel like threats. His first clash with Ichigo when he's just completely dominating him, like slapping him around, was pretty effective at establishing his threat. It was the first time in the arc where the threat of the Bounce actually seemed legitimate. Like, oh yes, this could be an actual problem for the Soul Reapers. Karya's characterization, for the most part, focused a lot on his disillusionment and his nihilism and his philosophies, as he hated the Soul Reapers for what they did to the Bounce, but even grew to resent his own people, which I thought was a pretty fascinating aspect to him. He was so far gone and really seemed to just want everything to end. And I always enjoy when a vampire is kind of just done with their immortal existence and they want out. I always think there's a lot to explore there. The cost on the mind of living this way for this long. And it's understandable. Karya kind of falls into that trope of a vampire wanting out, and I kind of dug that. And I liked the juxtaposition of this guy that can rally all these people to him, when in actuality he's this kind of introverted guy that had seen so many awful things and had kind of given up on his existence. Everything else was just a means to try to die, I guess. It was the execution of these ideas that could have been better though, which is something that I will keep saying about this arc. Karya's motives and plans could be a bit muddy at times, but I thought he was decent enough. As a filler villain, he was fine, and it kind of came to an interesting ending, but being the big bad of the arc, I was kind of hoping for a little bit more by the end. Like a lot of things in the Bount arc, we just needed to hone in and focus rather than throwing more and more things on top, but more on that later. If anyone's curious about how I would rank these Bounts from worst to best, it would probably go like this. At 10, we have the Water Boys. They were a joke. At 9, Yoshi. Didn't enjoy her at all. 8, Utagawa. Like I said, I forgot he was even a thing because him and his snakes feel like they were from a lifetime ago by the end of the arc, and they weren't that memorable. At number 7, Cain. While he was a flashback-only character, I did feel bad for him. I really did. At number 6, Mabushi, who is like the definition of whatever. Okay powers, okay personality, I won't remember him in a week. At number 5, Ugaki. I love a mad scientist, even when they are this basic of a mad scientist. At number 4, Yoshino. I respect her for being the rogue Bount, and she was a solid character among them when it comes to having actual dimensions and motivations. She was good. 3, Karya. Like I said, I liked him as the main villain, but he maybe could have been a bit better. Number 2, Sawatari. Respect the elderly. Number 1, Koga. Obviously this is my boy. He was easily the best Bount, no question. No question, Koga's the best. And if you're especially curious, here's how I would rank their dolls. Number 10, Ghoul and Gunter. They were literally just blobs of water. At number 9, Freed. It was just a talking snake. At number 8, Nita, a bit silly, and Big Mom eventually did it much better. Number 7, Messer. I was kind of underwhelmed when we finally got to see this doll, after wondering the whole arc what Karia's doll must be like. It's just a sword made of wind, and sometimes lightning. Maybe it was different before it merged with him, but yeah, as it was, as just kind of a sword, bit underwhelming. Number 6, Wainton is apparently the name of the doll Kane summoned for like 2 seconds, and again, that thing was terrifying in how it was tiny and cute, but so quickly turned on him, so unsettling, and I would have loved for it to have been the true villain of the arc or something. It blasted off somewhere, or it died, I don't know. If it turned out Kane was the main villain of this arc, and this doll was like controlling him or something and keeping him alive, listen, that could have been awesome. Could have been awesome, but that also would have made this arc even longer. At number 5, Ritza. I forget how he says it. I'm pretty sure it's like Ritza. Controls people's minds. I liked the visual of how it would like plant itself into you. That was kind of fun. It was fine. Number 4, Gezel. Look at this thing. It was an actual monster, and I loved it coming out of the shadows. Really cool design. Number 3, Goethe. He was a real one, and I actually cared about what happened to him. R.I.P. Number 2, Baura. I just loved that we had a giant multi-dimensional fish. It felt like a fever dream, and I loved every second of it. And at number 1, as if there was any question, Dalk. Association with Koga helps, but she was so fun. Just this sadistic weapon that was versatile and always enjoyable to watch, as she loved bloodshed. What a great, weird design as well. The Princess Leia buns on the side of her head, and the weird, creepy face that's always smiling. Come on. Good stuff. Loved it. Weird, but great. But not every antagonist in the Bount arc was a Bount. The idea of a treacherous Soul Reaper isn't exactly a new one, even at the time when this was initially released. Hell, at that point, we just had 3 traitors make themselves known right before this arc, but it was still very intriguing to see that these soul-sucking vampires had a Soul Reaper on their team with Maki Ichinose. I liked his fit with his slightly more casual Soul Reaper clothes with the hood, but I especially loved his Zanpakuto, like maybe one of my favorite ones in the whole series, and it isn't even canon. It can bend light in all kinds of ways, blinding people, making him invisible. It was just a really fun weapon. I don't know how some filler Soul Reaper villain got a sword that cool, but I'm glad he has it. It helped a lot. When you see a Soul Reaper fighting against his own brethren and teaming up with their enemies, you're naturally gonna wonder why, and this arc tries very hard to justify Ichinose's actions. As we learn, he abandoned his position in Squad 11 after his captain was killed by Kenpachi Zaraki in the fight that we've heard about before. We knew in the canon that Zaraki killed the previous Kenpachi in order to take his place as captain, so it was kinda cool that this took a little backstory moment from the canon and tried to build off of that, even though that did kinda bite it in the ass in the end, so maybe it should have just avoided trying to expand on Kubo's history that he hadn't been able to share yet. I don't know. But Ichinose is furious that his captain was killed, and initially it's like, okay, solid reason for revenge. But the moment I started really thinking about it, it quickly started to fall apart, because it's not like Kenny murdered his captain. He challenged him to a duel in front of like 200 witnesses, which is, in the canon, is an established method of gaining captaincy. And the best part is that in Squad 11, which I'll remind you Ichinose is a part of, Squad 11 in particular, killing the previous captain, it's how you get the Kenpachi name and become the next captain of Squad 11. So this has happened like 9 times before. It's not this unprecedented thing. It's the way Ichinose's squad works, and you would think with him being a member of that squad, he would understand how things work within the squad. He would understand how this squad operates and their traditions and values. So he just looks silly when he's complaining about this. Like, yes, you can be pissed, but you look silly when you're making such a big stink out of it when this is just, unfortunately, how things go in this squad. I was excited that Ichinose had a connection to Kenny because, as you know, I'm a massive fan of Kenpachi, so it would bring Kenny into the arc. But this being Ichinose's motive falls flat with what we know about Squad 11 and what their members are like. I just have trouble believing that he was part of that squad at all. To be that upset over it, it just didn't feel like a Squad 11 thing. Ichinose was giving Ilaria sand from Game of Thrones. For those that don't know, I'll be vague. someone close to her died in a perfectly legal duel that they volunteered for and lost. So instead of accepting the outcome, her entire character afterward is her just saying that her friend was murdered when that wasn't what happened. She was there, she saw this person take part in a perfectly legal duel in front of a crowd of people and they lost the duel. And that's what Ichinose was doing. He was like, Kenpachi murdered him. No, he didn't. Killed, yes. Murdered, arguable. Grief and anger and denial are understandable for Ilaria Sand and for Ichinose, but when it's something so established in that world, it just makes that motivation come off as a little silly, you know? Like, yes, you can be upset someone you liked was killed by someone you don't respect, but Ichinose acts like the killing itself was wrong, when it's a pretty traditional death for Squad 11. That's probably how a Kenpachi would want to go out. And there's another part of this too. Because this came out way before the elaboration, and it seems like Kubo wasn't involved in the Bount arc at all, I know that the creators of the Bount arc knew next to nothing about Kenny's predecessor at the time. I understand that, I'm not going to hold that against them. But it's funny in retrospect that Turn Back the Pendulum told us that the Kenpachi before Kenny was this lazy guy that no one really liked, while Ichinose here is acting like he was the epitome of goodness and chivalry and the greatest dude of all time. Again, I can't really hold it against what wasn't revealed at the time. The creators didn't know, I'm sure. It's just kind of funny with what we know now, looking back. Ichinose threw it all away for a guy that actually apparently kind of sucked. A patron even suggested that maybe Kubo wrote in that the 10th Kenpachi was like that just to spite the Bount arc since he wasn't a fan. I don't know if that's true, but the thought makes me laugh. That's the level of pettiness I can get behind. That's amazing. Probably not true, but I'd like to think it is. But yes, we have a traitor Soul Reaper who is angry at the Soul Society after a friend of his died, so he joins up with a bigger bad to get some vengeance. So, welcome back, Kaname Tozen. Ichinose is pretty similar, he just completely lacks Tozen's drip, and instead comes off a little like a whiny dork that needs someone to follow, and he has a flimsy motivation. I did enjoy his inevitable clash with Kenny. Once we knew Ichinose's backstory, it was pretty clear that they would have to face off at some point. It was just like 40 episodes later. What I enjoyed most about it though was, expectedly, Ichinose never stood a chance, no matter how hard he tried. He throws everything he has at Kenpachi after all this time of wanting payback, and he isn't able to do much of anything to him. Kenny being this insurmountable force here just really drives home that Ichinose's quest for vengeance is a futile one. And I liked that Kenny's words got through to him and he eventually turned on Karia after he survived that. Sure, he got killed for it, but I respect the little bit of growth that we got from him. I wish I liked Ichinose more than I do, but unfortunately, once we really got into his character, the initial intrigue that he had dissipated pretty quickly, but his Zanpakuto remained awesome. I loved that lightsaber. That was great. Overall, I don't mind the antagonists of this arc. I don't think they're anything spectacular, but they're serviceable for this story. I'd put them on par with some of the movie villains. They're just fine. They're alright. Karia and Koga, I would put probably above any of the movie villains. Everyone else, it's questionable. I do think there was a missed opportunity to make the Bounts a bit more sympathetic because their backstory lends itself well to that. They didn't ask for any of this. They were literally born this way because of a mistake made by cosmic forces that were outside of their control. And because of that, they were cursed to this immortal life where they had to feed on ghosts and were persecuted just for existing. They were the victims of Soul Reaper experiments, and that was something that didn't quite get enough focus. You have some, like Koga and Karia, where you can feel them react in ways that make sense with what they're going through and what their lives have been like. But most of the rest of the Bounts, because we don't really know anything about them, seem straight up evil and cruel for the sake of being evil. It would have helped to at least get glimpses of what made them that way and what they had to do to survive for centuries. I wish we got to see the tragedy of this a bit more, instead of being played off as kind of one-note villains. And with the ludicrous amount of episodes that this arc was given, this year's worth of episodes, there's no excuse for so many of the Bounts to be so undercooked or paper thin. We had the time to make them great, but that time wasn't used properly. And in the end, it really was time that was the greatest enemy to these timeless vampires. One of the biggest problems with filler is often it makes you feel stuck, because it makes the series' characters and storylines take a sudden, halt. Since these episodes are only meant to stall for more time, taking a literally unnecessary detour before returning to the main story, no one who is part of the canon material are really allowed to progress in any meaningful ways, at least not in any ways that would affect the actual journey. Everyone has to be stagnant, or in some cases, even set back. And by the end of the filler, everything kind of needs to be back to status quo anyway, back to where we would have been if these episodes never happened. Because when it comes to the manga, they never did. Sure, there may be little references to the filler in the anime later to pretend like it happened, but for the most part, these characters and the story need to mostly be unchanged in the grand scheme of things. That's the real curse of filler material. It has to happen for some real life reason, but within the story, it mostly has to feel completely inconsequential. Everything and everyone in the story is stifled and unable to move forward. The most they can do is take a few steps back or keep walking in place, but never actually progress. It's a curse, and it's the price we have to pay for fillers. Unless you do the filler about completely separate characters, which, that's an interesting route that they could have taken. But even then, if those characters are in the main story, we still have to kind of work with those boundaries. The Bount arc is riddled with this problem, and it's only amplified because of just how much of it there is, and the lengths they have to go to accommodate for just how long this adventure is. They try in some cases, I'll give them credit, but no character can evolve or change in an actual permanent way, which is frustrating over the course of 45 episodes. Most of the time, you'd expect some growth in that amount of episodes, but we really can't, and it can be so tough watching how they try to handle this. One of the biggest examples. Were you excited to see Ichigo attain Bankai at the end of the Soul Society arc? Yeah? Well, too bad he can't use it anymore. Why? I don't know. Yes, Ichigo suddenly can't use Bankai for the majority of this arc, and I get it. They probably felt like we gotta nerf him so he can't just beat all of these Bounts immediately, or that we don't want to put Ichigo in a position where Bankai seems so ordinary, or even seems weak against a non-canon opponent, when it's still the big new thing at this point, and it's gonna be the big new thing when you get back to the Arrancar arc. I understand the reasoning, maybe, for it, but I don't really like the decision. It felt like the most blatantly filler move where we have to take something away that Ichigo's already achieved so that he has to relearn it somehow over the course of this arc. It's so there can be an illusion of growth when he gets it back inevitably. But the in-story reasoning for the restriction was kind of weak, like, oh, he hadn't fully gotten used to using it yet, especially in the human world. And they don't even explore much of how he feels about losing this power either. It just was a real shame to have to take Ichigo's stuff away just so the threat can be a threat and that Ichigo can be learning something over the course of the arc, but not really because it doesn't get much focus. At least he gets it back once the Bounts become powerful enough to face it. At least there's that. I still didn't like that choice at all, and it's the biggest example of how filler cannot allow progression and has to find ways to avoid it. This one was just blatantly for the sake of filler and keeping things from moving forward. While I didn't like how his Bankai was used, or not used, one thing with Ichigo that I did love was the very brief appearance of his hollow mask taking over his body during a fight about halfway through the arc. It didn't last long, but I appreciated that because it felt relevant to that period of Bleach and to Ichigo's story, and a natural step toward where the plotline would be heading when the manga started being adapted after the filler. I could have used a little more of it even, but I just appreciated it being addressed because it should be something that's starting to be a problem at that point. It felt like a natural inclusion and an expansion over what had been set up in the Soul Society arc and would become even more prevalent when we return to the canon. It felt naturally in place where it should, unlike the Bankai. Because so much of Bleach is anchored to Ichigo's growth, it's just super noticeable how held back he is, and they don't explore that much either. Like, he's just kind of like, it's weird that I can't use my Bankai, but it doesn't weigh on him much, and there isn't much time given to his psychology during that loss, until he suddenly figures it out and can use it again. Everything with Ichigo being kind of held back in this arc felt very manufactured, except for the Hollow Mask moment, probably because, like I said, that was an actual problem from the manga that he should be dealing with in the time that this filler takes place. One character's journey that I thought was similar in that it was kind of dictated by the restrictions of filler, but surprisingly worked much better, was Uryu. At this point in the series, he's powerless after the Soul Society arc, and doesn't get those powers back until a bit into the Arrancar arc when his dad shows up. Since this arc occurs between those 2 points, you'd think Uryu would just be powerless the whole time and maybe not even include him, you know? But instead, I gotta give the creators credit, they actually give Uryu a lot of focus, and we get to really sit with him during this tough period, which we didn't really get a chance to do in the main series. Hell, we get to see the moment that the others find out that he doesn't have his powers. It was nice to be able to explore how he feels about this, and naturally, much like Ichigo does later in the Fullbringer arc, Uryu feels useless, and we see time and time again throughout the first half of this arc that he is so vulnerable without his abilities. But what I really liked, not only was that they didn't ignore him, and they didn't make him sit this arc out, but instead, they made him, and his current situation, a pivotal part of the plot. The Bounts need Uryu to enact their plan, so he becomes a target for their scheme. For the first half of the arc, Uryu is kind of the MacGuffin that the villains are after, but it works actually, because it makes him valued in a time when he feels he has no value to speak of. Even the Bounts are disappointed when they find out he doesn't have his powers, because they need those powers. So poor timing on their part, very poor timing. But by the end, Uryu is given a chance to be a hero when Nemu gifts him with an artifact that allows him to use his powers again. And naturally I'm like, that thing can't last long because he needs to be powerless again by the next arc. And yes, that was the case, and even that worked pretty well because it felt like this ticking clock while also letting him be part of the action. Again, you're just waiting for his new abilities to go away at a time where he really needs them, and he's able to be helpful until then. Everything they did with Uryu had to work within the confines of the canon. He needed to start powerless and end powerless, but they found interesting avenues for him in the middle that I really enjoyed overall. Yeah, his little tragic romance angle with Yoshino wasn't bringing tears, but it was compelling enough when it was around, I guess, even when it seemed to be stuck in a cycle of the same thing happening for like 10 episodes. Between actually handling him well here in the Bount arc and the massive improvements Uryu's been given in the Thousand Year Blood War anime, it really seems like the animation studio just loves him, and I appreciate it. They keep helping him out. Rukia is also in a similar position to Uryu here, where what she's allowed to do is kind of dictated by what we see with her in the canon around this time. She's still recovering her Soul Reaper abilities, and we can't see her use her Zanpakuto yet until the beginning of the Arrancar arc. So the solution is to just kind of drag her along where she's still just using Kitos. I do think it kind of takes away from her grand return as a Soul Reaper again if you're watching the anime straight through, I imagine. I prefer it being that she's freed in the Soul Society, and then the next time you see her, she's fully restored, rather than this extra trip to the living world in the meantime, and spending all of these extra episodes with her. Like, I feel like her absence in between was important, I think. I don't know if she should even be here. But she has some decent moments. It's Rukia. I love the girl. It's still nice to see her, even if I'd prefer she doesn't show up till she's supposed to. The rest of the cast, unfortunately, isn't given much to do. Chad and Orihime kind of each get one of the mod souls to hang out with, and I naturally loved Chad and Noba as a duo because Chad gets a decent fight with Baura where it's him and Noba and Rangiku. That part's okay. Orihime, she gets like a kind of a fight with a mind-possessed Rukia at one point. Other than that, she doesn't really do much. Heals a few people here and there. But yeah, it was a time where I feel like the Bounts are the type of enemies that they could fight. So I feel like they should have been given more focus. But, you know, Chad not being given the focus he deserves is kind of a running thing throughout Bleach. So maybe it is respecting the canon by doing that. Some of the other Soul Reapers join in on some of the fights and get more involved as the story goes, but because this is filler, these Soul Reapers can't really unleash any cool new techniques unless they've already been shown in the canon. So unfortunately for a lot of these characters that don't shine until a bit later in Bleach, like Hisagi, the things they can do here in this arc are a bit limited, so the action doesn't tend to usually ramp up in the ways you'd expect it to, because they can't reveal a Bankai, they can't even show a Shikai if they have never done it before. before up to this point. So that does kind of hamper things here and there. Still, part of the reason I wanted to watch the fillers to begin with was to spend more time with characters in this universe, and we absolutely get more time with some of them, even if that time isn't used to give them anything overly substantial. A lot of these problems just come with fillers, you know? Characters not being able to move forward, characters not being able to use cool moves. It's a mixed bag of how they're able to navigate those challenges. Like I said, Uryu's stuff was pretty great. Ichigo's not so much. Everyone else, definitely good and bad. It's tough. I understand the restrictions of filler, and I'm sure this was very difficult to try to do 45 episodes that couldn't actually mean anything. So as I was watching the arc, I was obviously wondering, where did these centuries-old immortal soul-sucking vampires even come from? Was there a soul-eating mutant bat that bit them? Is their hunger for souls connected to the Hollow's hungers for souls? I kept thinking maybe that'll be an angle at some point. Never gets addressed that they both like to chow down on souls. Unfortunately, my Hollow babies don't get to stay beautifully, eternally young when they eat souls. Did Karia make a deal with Charles Dance in a Transylvanian cave? How did these vampires happen? Well, turns out, naturally, the Soul Society is responsible for the creation of the Bounts. Because of course they are. There's always some shadiness going on beneath the Soul Society. They were trying to make souls immortal, because why not? Until it blew up in their faces, and the accident mutated some souls in the reincarnation cycle, so a whole bunch of Bounts were born from those souls. The souls they were initially experimenting with were a precursor to the mod souls we know, so there is a connection there, just one that's only really a passing line of dialogue when it could have been a way to connect some of our new characters, like, you know, our 3 mod souls. You could have really connected them to the villains of the arc. I would have loved for them to lean into that, but again, it might just be because I'm itching for some focus on the mod souls, and for them to be given something deeper than their surface level comic relief. For a little bit, I was thinking maybe Aizen was going to turn out to be the one that created the Bounts, and that they were just another one of his many experiments, and that might make it so the filler arc at least sort of feels relevant to the bigger threat that's going on at this time. And hey, we could have connected the souls that were getting devoured by the Bounts to the fragments of souls that Aizen was feeding to the Hogyaku. But then again, that reveal was probably way too far ahead for the anime to even know about. But yeah, any hope for Aizen's involvement turned out not to be the case at all. When it seemed like they were trying to open a gateway to Waco Mundo, I was like, oh, that's a bad idea, because right now, Aizen is there with an army of Arankars. So if they opened the portal and immediately got killed by, like, Baragan, you know what? I kind of would have liked that. That could have been funny. Anyway, another layer to this Bount origin is that the Soul Reaper scientist that created them, Ron Tao, shows up in the present, trying to fix her mistakes. We do see that she was pivotal to the Bount's past in other ways too, besides just creating them. She did try to help them, especially when they were being purged by the Soul Society, because the Bounts haven't had an easy life, dealing with persecution, having wars with Soul Reapers and Quincy's, and generally feeling like their lives are a big cosmic mistake, because they kind of are. Ron Tao resembling Yoshino really didn't amount to much besides a few longing looks from Uryu, and they really brushed over the explanation. Apparently, the artificial souls that became the Bounts that were being experimented on were based on souls of Soul Reapers at the time, so there are Soul Reapers that look just like the Bounts, like Ron Tao and Yoshino. So maybe Karia has a Soul Reaper that looks like him. There's a Soul Reaper that looks like Sawatari, but maybe he never looked old. But yeah, some Soul Reapers must look like the Bounts according to this, and I just feel like that's a weird thing to include and then not do anything with. I don't even think Karia acknowledges that Ron Tao looks like Yoshino either, by the way, even though he spent like centuries with Yoshino. So I don't know why you go through the trouble of making Yoshino a doppelganger of Ron Tao if you're not gonna do anything with the idea. It could have helped emphasize how Bounts aren't natural or have an identity crisis or something, but they barely mention it. It really just saved a character designer a little time, I guess. Like Ron Tao's just Yoshino with glasses. And a very weak reason why. Ron Tao felt a little bit half-baked and thrown in toward the end to give the lore drops about the Bounts, the Jokai crest, and all of the things we didn't know for the first 35 episodes of the arc. She was there to fill us in on everything we probably should have had more evenly dispersed beforehand. Apparently, Ron Tao was exiled after accidentally creating the Bounts, or for helping them at first, but rather than like flee the Soul Society, it turns out she just kind of lived in a hole there. I don't know. She didn't really work for me as a character, but I dug the overall explanation for the Bounce backstory, that they were created by an accident by the Soul Society. I just think we could have ramped up parts of it to make them more layered. Again, their lives as immortal beings could have given us plenty of interesting material to work with, and we got very little of that. We don't see nearly enough of them living in different eras, but unfortunately, a lot of the backstory was pushed aside for a drawn-out and pretty messy storyline in the present. One of the biggest criticisms I've seen of the Bount arc is that it's just too long, and now that I've finished, I can safely say that yes, the Bount arc is indeed way too long. I'm sure they wanted it to be to let the anime get really far ahead of them, but this arc really suffers from just how much of it there is when it feels like the core story elements could maybe have made for a really good 20 or so episodes. But it's double that. And that's me talking, and I watched like a few episodes at a time. I can't imagine what it was like when it was just one episode a week. I really started to feel it toward the middle of the arc, because for a little while there, it really felt like we were going in circles with the Bounce after Uryu getting rescued, insert Yoshino and him having heart-to-hearts sometimes, and then cut to Karia conspiring, rinse and repeat. It was like 3 or 4 times that kept happening, that Uryu was kidnapped or about to be kidnapped, and then got away, or got saved, and then got grabbed back. Then they sent more people after him. It just kept happening over and over for like, I don't know, 10 episodes. I think the peak excitement in the early stages of the arc was going to the Bounce mansion and facing off with Karia for the first time. That was actually really hype for a couple episodes, but afterward, things settled down again for a very long time, and we'd get these ramp-ups now and then that would then die down over and over again. Every time it felt like we were rising up to something exciting, there would be something that diffused the excitement so that it would take a few more episodes to get back to the action. And that happens all the way through the arc, with the biggest example for me being right at the end, when Karia gains the power of the Jokai crest, and things are looking terrible, and you're expecting this to be the intense climactic clash, or for him to now enact his plan, only for Karia to be like, I will destroy all of you in one day, so hang out until then. It was frustrating, because I thought we were about to get the final battle, and then he just decided not yet. We still need to pad it out a little longer. Every time I'd start to get really excited, the arc would cut off that hype and delay it. And then by the time it got back to what I was excited for, I was kind of already over it. It was just blatantly stalling, because, filler. One of the things the Bount arc really struggles with is efficiency. With an arc that nearly has 50 episodes worth of time, I feel like they don't use that time nearly as well as they could. We are introduced to some admittedly really interesting concepts and potentially some really fascinating characters, but we often don't get to dive into any of it too much, and instead just keep throwing in new things that don't amount to anything and only seem to be there to create new footage to put into the episode. Like the Beto bugs. The Beto bugs turned out to kind of not amount to anything for how big of a deal they were initially presented to be. There was this whole ceremony where they're created. It took a sacrifice of a character to bring them out. So with all of the dramatics surrounding their creation and their introduction, they turned out to really just be plot devices to make the Bounce stronger more quickly. But by doing that, by having these like giant bugs go jab people and steal their souls, by doing that, you took away from the vampire aspect in some ways, since after that, we never saw any of the Bounce try to suck the soul out of someone again. It's a paradoxical thing, where the Betos were brought into the story to hasten events, but actually just made things slow down. Because then the Betos were just being used as another problem we had to deal with on top of the Bounce, which then delayed the fight with the Bounce. It added more filler on top of the filler that we already had. And worst of all, the threat the Betos posed didn't really feel as big as I think it should have. Swarms of harmful supernatural insects can be scary. Just ask Yu Yu Hakusho when this happened in the Chapter Black Saga. Yep. We also spent an episode or two with these mod soul shenanigans where they were setting up booby traps at Ichigo's place like they were Kevin McAllister. We spent a whole episode showing this, maybe two, I can't remember. Just them putting up traps around the house because the bounce, they're just all these little traps at the front door, on the rugs, on the carpets, everything. You know who doesn't end up being caught in any of these traps? The bounce. They don't even come near them. But hey, filler's gonna filler, I guess. When we eventually do get to the climax of the arc, I'm conflicted. The final battle taking place in the Soul Society is a tough one for me. Not only was the means to get there kind of convoluted, and it had to be this whole thing where you had to get Uryu to open the door, but in order for Uryu to open the door, he needed his powers. But to get his powers back, you had to hack into Mayori's files and get him to remember that there's this device that could give Uryu his powers back. So they give Uryu his powers back, but because his powers are back, now he can open the gate, and he has a chance not to open the gate, but he does it intentionally. He wants to fight the bounce in the Soul Society because the Soul Reapers will be more powerful there, completely forgetting the fact that these people absorb reishi and eat it. So by bringing the bounce to the Soul Society, you're essentially inviting them to a buffet, and they're actually going to be way more powerful than they would have been if you just took them out right then and there. It was a lot to get that gate open. I was like, why are you doing this? And it was very confusing. Eventually I figured it out. He didn't even have the excuse of like Doctor Strange handing over the Infinity Stone because he saw the future. Uryu didn't see the future. He was just like, yeah, let's fight them there. We'll be stronger than them. And it's like, bro, that's where they're at their most powerful, man. What are you doing? But yeah, getting to the Soul Society was kind of a mess. And then having the climax of the arc take place there was also something I kind of struggled with. On one hand, I do like that they go somewhere where the bounce will have an unlimited amount of spirit energy to eat, so they're stronger and pose more of a believable threat. Should Uryu have opened the door for them? Absolutely not. At least not willingly. But I like that at least they will be more of a challenge in theory. But honestly, once they get there, I don't think they use that advantage the bounce would have as much as they could and probably should once they're there. I expected the bounce to be eating all of the souls in the Rukon district. I liked the potential possibilities of them being in the Soul Society, but I feel like the creators didn't capitalize on it very much. But on the other hand, the hand that doesn't really like this, the anime just had the Soul Society arc right before. And now we've got to see another Ryoka breach? Get your security fixed, Soul Society. It just was not a good look. This happened not that long after the Soul Society. It's been what? Weeks? Months? Not very long. Not nearly long enough for allowing this to happen again. It just makes them look incompetent. I can't remember. Did they say that their security's still, not fully repaired or something? That might have helped. But yeah, I don't really like that we're going right back to the place where the entirety of the last arc took place. It all just felt a bit repetitive and samey when thinking about when this is placed, and that's probably only amplified if you're watching this after the Soul Society arc. I just would have preferred a different backdrop for the third act. Yes, I know the whole point of the bounce plan was to go there, but change up the circumstance, change up their motive, have them fight at some ancient Gothic castle or something. Just something to spice it up. I don't even think they make great use of the Soul Society here anyway. For example, another really weird pacing thing that popped up in this last section was how Karia and the Bounce finally arrive in the Soul Society after all their scheming, so you expect that maybe they'll attack? Maybe? But instead, they go to the Rukon district, and we spend like 4 or 5 episodes watching Karia start a class war in the Soul Society. And I'm like, weird choice. These normal souls don't stand a chance against Soul Reapers, so why are you assembling them as an army? But hey, maybe it'll be a fun commentary on the system here. And after they're pumped up by Ikaria's speech and they turn their forest into a war machine, right when this mob is at the gates and they manage to open the gates, Karia discards them and is like, alright, you've done your job, you can leave. We watched the Bounce make this whole deal for multiple episodes, only for them to go, actually, we just needed you to open a door. They keep manipulating people to open doors, so I guess that's apropos, but why did we build all of that up so much? I never thought it would lead anywhere drastic, like, these people were never going to be able to pose a threat, but it was an interesting idea that just led to such an anticlimactic moment. I thought we might be getting a situation where he sends them in as fodder, like that scene in Braveheart when the English send my ancestors into battle first, or maybe even Karya would use these people as shields that the Soul Reapers wouldn't want to harm, since, you know, it's their duty to protect the souls of the Soul Society. But no, we don't get any of that. After episodes of setup, he just tells them to go home. At the very least, couldn't Karya have absorbed them to really remind us how manipulative he is? I thought the Bounce would be having a buffet in the Soul Society, but they don't even feed on anyone. They just trick some criminals and blue-collar workers into building a wench. If that was all this was going to amount to, I think I would have preferred that we skip the whole Rukon District manipulation thing and just have the Bounce be able to absorb the gateway or something. They take spirit energy off of all kinds of buildings in the Soul Society, so why not just have them immediately attack? Straight up eat the gate. That's way scarier and could have saved us a lot of time. But okay, now that the Bounce are finally inside, maybe this will lead to some great fights. But it turns out none of the fights here are really anything great. That goes for really the vast majority of the fights in the whole arc, unfortunately. They're all either serviceable or underwhelming, and nothing really stands out in my memory from these battles, even ones that I was excited for. Some of them are solid, they're alright, but looking back on it, I'm struggling to think of specific hype moments or anything like that within those fights. The Bounce are able to hold their own sometimes, but even when they do, it's not anything spectacular. I'm trying to think what the best fight of the arc would even be. Ichigo versus Ichinose in the mansion was pretty cool, I guess. But that's Soul Reaper on Soul Reaper action. And even the fight between Kenpachi and Ichinose, the fight itself wasn't great, but I was liking the dynamics within the fight and what was happening, but the actual, battle wasn't anything amazing. I don't know. I think the lack of memorable fights is probably a byproduct of what we talked about earlier. The characters aren't really able to show anything new in the filler. We can't get Bankai reveals. We can't have them use attacks that they'll never use in the actual manga. The heroes are kind of restricted by that, so it really falls on the villains to showcase some big things, but sadly, a lot of them don't. There are some cool dolls that we've talked about, Baura, Doc, but the fights, This situation should kind of force the writer to think outside the box of how to utilize these confrontations, and they try a few times, but yeah, none of the fights really have a lasting spectacle to them. There's not moments that I'm like, oh yeah, what a great part of that fight. No, nothing like that. Even the final fight is lacking a little something as everything comes to a head with Ichigo versus Karya after we introduce the last minute concept of the Jokai crests that are apparently buried beneath Soul Society, and Karya is going to try to detonate them and all of that. Where the hell did that come from? With so little setup for all of that, the fight felt very manufactured at the last minute. We needed to give everyone else something to do while Ichigo fought Karya. So they're off defusing these random bombs we just learned about, and the fight itself was lacking some tension and had some last minute philosophical ideas that really should have been brought up earlier, and then the fight suddenly ends very abruptly. Karya just disappears after a clash. We're hastily told after the fact that maybe this is what Karya wanted the whole time, which, like I talked about earlier, talking about Karya, it's an interesting idea, and I wish it wasn't one that was presented at the very end, and instead was something we got to really ponder throughout his scenes. Our big bad wanted to die, and yes, just like the villain in the chapter Black arc of Yu Yu Hakusho. I think that's the last comparison, I promise. Although, Ichinose helping out this group is kind of like what's-his-name in the chapter Black arc helping Sensui. An outside force who's not like the others, but is essential to their plans. That's the real last comparison, I swear. But yes, Karya suddenly dies, the Jokai crests are neutralized, while the last remaining Bount, my boy Koga, goes off with Ron Tao into the void of filler characters, who most likely we will never see again. Farewell, Koga. I liked you. But yeah, everything just kind of goes back to normal, and it becomes even more apparent that a filler arc like this won't leave a lasting impact on the story. Yes, in the anime, the 3 mod souls stick around for a bit, like I talked about, and my friend reminded me that a manifestation of Karia showed up in the anime during an Ichigo mental training session. I think it was during the Arankar arc, but outside of that, what happened in the Bount arc stays in the Bount arc. So it's over after 45 episodes. And what did it amount to in the end? The Bount arc is just a lot. But did I hate it? No. Did I love it? No. But I was expecting something much worse than what I got. But again, I think some of that negative impact is softened for me by watching it when I did, instead of how many of you may have experienced it. That probably made a big difference, honestly, because I definitely would have disliked it more if I was slowly seeing it play out week to week, or if I didn't already know it was filler and it was keeping me from continuing on to the Arankar arc. I can understand why some people say they almost quit Bleach during this arc, because if you watched it at that time, or you didn't know this wasn't canon, you're kind of stuck for a long time with no forward momentum, and the story of Bleach comes to a grinding halt for a long time. It's one thing if it was like 5 episodes, hell 10 episodes, but this was 45 episodes with a plot that did not need to be 45 episodes. And 45 episodes of an anime original story isn't an impossible task to make good or even great. It's just a really challenging one, and the Bount arc overall wasn't able to overcome a lot of the weight of its own ambition. This story was stretched out too much stuff piled onto it, it lost focus, it often didn't use the time in ways that would help make this more impactful, make it more exciting. There were times when I really enjoyed myself, and was happy to see completely new concepts for the series, and to just be on a side adventure in this Bleach universe with characters I love. There were parts I really did enjoy. The bounce as a concept, I kind of liked. The dolls, I liked. The concept of Ichinose, cool. The mystery of all of this, I dug. But there were a lot of things that were either dragged out or not explored enough, or somehow both, that hampered a lot of that enjoyment. There were some fantastic ideas in here, but it's the execution of those ideas that didn't always work, and often hindered the flow of the story. There were so many parts that we could have cut out, and we wouldn't lose anything that significant, and would have improved the pacing tremendously. Cut the random Ganju and Hanataro stuff with them working at the convenience store. Was it a little funny? Yes, but we didn't even need Ganju until they got to the Soul Society, and even then, he didn't do much because he was mostly around for the fake-out class war in the Rukon district. Cut all of that too, for it didn't amount to anything besides opening a gate. Cut the Betos, get rid of a couple of the least interesting bounts, like the water people, although that made me laugh. Maybe keep that, that was really funny. There was just so much. Any of the good got lost under all the other stuff that was all just there to make this last long. The Bount arc is one of the most filler of fillers I've ever seen. And yes, its unnecessarily long length really is the biggest culprit. If this arc was half as long, even a third of it, I think it would be so much better. If they needed to buy a year's worth of time, why not have like 2 filler arcs instead of making one giant one? I respect the ambition in trying to make this vast new story, but it just doesn't fully work. This filler arc was meant to just count down the clock. And yes, it did succeed at that. If you can survive having your soul slowly sucked out by the pacing, the lack of character progression, the mostly mediocre fights, and the daunting length, then you'll find some really interesting concepts and lore, some decent antagonists, and the glory that is Noba as a turtle wearing a bow tie. For me, the Bount arc was fine. Nothing great, but far from the worst thing I've ever seen. But dang, it could have been so much better if they really made the most of their time. There were some really great things within this, but there was so much of everything else. If you're still here, thanks for sticking through the video, and thanks for re-experiencing the Bount arc vicariously through me. I know some people refused to do that. And I'm sure some people didn't want to think about this arc again, but here I am. I know this video was long. I had a lot of thoughts, clearly, and there were a lot of episodes to cover, and I don't know, it also seemed funny that an unnecessarily long arc deserved a necessarily long video. And yes, I'm aware that this video itself is filler for those of you wanting to see my thoughts on the ending of Bleach, because I still have a couple of those of the manga left, and I hope it was enjoyable. I hope you had fun. I hope you're not too mad that I even covered the Bount arc. I watched it, I talked about it, you watched me talk about it, and we're all okay. We're still here, somehow. The Bount arc eventually ended. As always, thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. If you want to see the entire reaction of me watching the Bount arc, it's all on Patreon. There's like 15 videos. It's all on a playlist. And you don't even have to watch the whole thing. I broke those down into highlights, so you see, parts of the episodes. You don't have to rewatch every episode with me. And when it comes to filler arcs, next up is the new Captain arc. So I'll be watching that on Patreon, and then coming back here with my analysis, just like I did for the Bount arc. I hope you guys all have a great day, and I'll see you soon, where we'll actually get back to the canon material of Bleach. Take care. Bye.